Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I'm the director of the China Environment Forum, where I've been hanging out at the Wilson Center actually for 23 years. I'm a lucky one, man. I got the best job in DC. I get to work with Chinese government, NGO business researchers, and most recently, in the last few years, our Asia program has had this fabulous China Fellows program. So I get to meet and hang out with, well, virtually these days, with some kind of the cutting edge researchers, young researchers looking into China. And a lot of them happen to be focused on the Belt and Road Initiative. I keep asking these folks, like, what are you calling yourselves? This new mafia of dynamic Chinese researchers. I should want to note that today's meeting, obviously, is co-sponsored by, well, Asia program, Kissinger Institute, our History and Public Policy, as well as my project. And yeah, I'm hoping someday I get to meet all these people live and in person, but today I'm really happy to welcome all of them to our session number 5 of our fellowship extravaganza, or can we say fellowship palooza? It's session 5 is China and its relations with developing countries in the global South. So most of our speakers today that we're going to be diving deep into Belt and Road initiatives, kind of looking at kind of thinking about different kinds of issues. There's a lot of these days on coal and climate stuff. We are having someone talking about coal, but I think we've got a really great diversity in trying to explore, how China is trying to transform the global South. What are some of the dynamics with the local governments and the impacts on the environment? I'm going to keep this intro short because I think you want to hear from them. We're going to start off today with Austin Strange. He's an assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong and fellow at Columbia Harvard China World Program. And so the research paper that he's did for us, and the research is called Highways to Influence, China's High Profile Global Development. Obviously you could tell from this title, he does his teaching and his research focuses on Chinese foreign policy, but he's also done work in the past looking at kind of the history of trade and diplomacy. So Austin will start us off, not quite yet. And then we'll hop on over to Kristen Hopewell up in Canada, I believe. Yes, she's an associate professor in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. And her research and the talk today is called Impact of China's Trade Policies on Global Development, honing in on agriculture and fisheries. I'm very excited for that. I've gone fishing a lot myself in my work. Her research specializes in international trade, global governance, industrial policy. And I'm really, and she's also done she did a book a while back called Clash of Powers, US-China Rivalry in Global Trade and Governance. So clearly today we're also going to talk about US-China relations a wee bit. Third, we have Meir Alkan. He is an assistant professor at Fordham University and a former Harvard Environmental Fellow at the Department of Government. And he's also has been a non-resident at Boston University GDP Center. I think all of you at some point are going to be an affiliate of the Boston folks, because if you do BRI, you're going to be part of their network as well. He's going to be talking about China's outward investments and global sustainability. But what's cool about it is that he's kind of trying to be a little bit of kind of like a myth buster of how we're thinking about the BRI. So quick recap. First, we're going to go for a ride on the Belt and Road roads with Austin. We're going to go fishing with Kristen. We're going to break stereotypes of the BRI. And then I realized I didn't introduce Emily. Emily is a associate professor of Chinese studies at the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at William and Mary. And we're actually going to be going dancing with her. It does unique research focusing on dance in China's, and using dance as diplomacy. She specializes, besides Chinese dance and performance, the PRC history of gender and ethnicity in modern and contemporary China. So again, we're going to drive down a road, we're going fishing, we're going to look at breaking stereotypes on how we think about the BRI, and we're also going dancing. So Austin, I know you're like, oh, I'm not dancing. That sounds cool. But you're doing cool things too. You're driving us down the highway, and I'd like to invite you to share your slides and talk. And so I also want to remind the audience that we would love it if you would ask questions. So if you could send an email to asia@wilsoncenter.org, asia@wilsoncenter.org, or via Twitter by tagging Asia program, all one word. It's below the screen here. And I think Austin's got his slides up. Audience, you're sitting down with your cup of coffee or tea. Let's get going. There we go, Austin, it's all yours.
Great, well, good morning, everyone, and good evening from Hong Kong, where I am right now. First off, I want to thank the Wilson Center, and in particular, Lucas Myers, Abe Denmark, and of course, Jennifer for hosting this panel, and the broader Wilson China Fellowship Program for including me and letting me be part of this discussion. Very happy to be here with you. My project, as the title here suggests, is on a class of development projects that China's government finances called high-profile international development projects, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. I focus on this topic because I think these projects are crucial to understanding the relationship between Chinese development finance and this question of Chinese influence in developing countries. Now, China is an increasingly large and impactful donor and lender in global development, as we all know. It is now the largest bilateral creditor in the world. And there are concerns about the aims and consequences of Chinese development finance, in particular, concerns about China's use of some of these projects to purchase influence in developing countries. And the BRI indeed is often at the center of these concerns. So when we think of the BRI, at least for me, I often think of images of a large scale infrastructure and other very grandiose high visibility projects. And that's really the intuition of my project here. Sorry about that, there we go. So I think this is true essentially no matter where we look along the Belt and Road Initiative and even beyond. We can look at the examples of Kenya and Sri Lanka, two high profile recipients of over $10 billion in financial commitments of development finance from China in recent years and since 2000. Both of these countries have received over 150 development projects from China between 2000 and 2017, according to aid data. But when we think of Sri Lanka, we often think, of course, of Hambantota Port, the birthplace, arguably, of the debt trap diplomacy narrative. And for Kenya, we think of one or a handful of high-profile projects like the Standard Gauge Railway. And this is also true if we look at recipients of Chinese financing who aren't always covered as much in international media. Consider Papua New Guinea. So similarly, Papua New Guinea has received over $6 billion in Chinese development finance commitments since 2000 across over 100 different projects. But when we think of Papua New Guinea and China's role in development there, we often think of flashy projects like this one. This is an international convention center that China's government built for the government of Papua New Guinea for an APEC meeting in 2018. Now, this project financially is less than 1% of the total financing that China's government provided to PNG over this period. But again, it takes the lion's share of both local and national and even international media headlines about what China is doing in PNG. And I think this is true. And again, in most countries we look at, a few projects often dominate local and national and even global narratives about Chinese development finance. And so my research project as part of this fellowship is designed to clarify links between specific types of projects that China provides and different types of influence outcomes. And I do this by conceptualizing and measuring, again, what I call high profile development projects. And this is a broad class of projects. It includes what I call prestige projects. You can think of convention centers like this one, stadiums, government buildings and ministries that China builds, lots of different shiny structures that China builds in developing countries and that Beijing has gained notoriety for in recent years. It also includes other tiers of high visibility projects like major transportation infrastructure projects as well. And now, of course, these projects are very different from each other, and I'm not claiming that they're all the same, but the idea is that these projects share a couple of important common features. First of all, they're highly visible. So people all around the country will know about these projects, even if they're not located in the immediate vicinity. And these projects are politically salient as well compared to other projects. And essentially they represent potential sources of political capital for host country politicians to use. Now, my research is somewhat of a big picture project. Of course, we've seen lots of really high quality case studies of these individual projects. And I'm trying to make basically a comprehensive accounting of these projects and show that this is a systematic phenomenon that we see over time. And so I use some original data collection. I use a number of surveys and case study analysis myself to understand the evolution of China's provision of these high profile projects from 1949 to 2020. And what you can see here in this figure is that high profile development projects are certainly not a BRI specific phenomenon. In fact, they've been around since the late 1950s. And so this is a resilient class of projects that we've seen over and over again. You can see in the upper portion of this figure, just the overall amount of prestige projects in this case that China's government has financed. And again, through this data collection effort, I found over 400 prestige projects that China's financed during this period. And if you look at the bottom half of this figure, what you see is that the salience of these prestige projects, so the percentage of prestige projects, or excuse me, the share of prestige projects as an overall percentage of the projects that China's financing is actually quite stable over time. And if you're at all familiar with the history of Chinese foreign aid and development finance, this is a bit striking because Mao Zedong's approach to foreign aid was very different than Deng Xiaoping's approach to foreign aid. And every leadership administration in China has had a different strategy to providing aid. Yet we see this class of projects, and in this case, prestige projects, persist across very different periods of Chinese foreign policy. So this is a pretty resilient type of project that we see. And I'm going to come back to that in a couple of minutes. So the second half of this research project is really about the other side of the equation and asking, how do high profile projects connect to this question of Chinese influence? And in my assessment, a lot of policy and also scholarly analyses of Chinese influence often make an implicit assumption when it comes to aid and debts from China, that more dollars leads to more influence. We often take somewhat of a linear approach, and we assume that if China's providing more money, it should be getting more influence. But one of the problems with this approach is that the definition of influence is not very clear. And so in my work, I draw a distinction between what I call routine influence on the one hand and unintended influence on the other. And I also consider the role of elite and popular audiences in these different influence processes. But the bottom line is that high profile development projects have potentially outsized consequences for both routine and unintended influence. And routine influence here you can think of as being kind of the classic textbook example of how governments use foreign aid to buy policy concessions. And so essentially the use of development projects to purchase policy influence over politicians in countries that host these projects. And in the case of high profile development projects, there is a really strong synergy between these international political interests on the Chinese side and domestic political interests of politicians on the host country side. And essentially, China allows many host countries and politicians in these countries to have a lot of agency over the types of projects they choose, where these projects go, and how these projects are branded domestically as well. And so this is a form of political capital that's provided by this external financing from China. And so again, high profile projects are uniquely able to do this because they are nationally salient. They have this high level of visibility, and these are often branded as being national achievements by the host governments that pursue them. And China, of course, knowing this, can provide these projects in exchange for political influence, for example, foreign policy concessions. And so what you see here, again, is kind of a classic example of how this works in the context of Chinese development finance. This is the Costa Rica National Stadium. This was the crown jewel of an aid package that China provided to the government of Costa Rica after the government abandoned diplomatic recognition of Taiwan in 2007. The stadium was committed in 2009, and it was completed just a couple of years later. And so this form of what I call routine elite level influence is pretty well documented. But the other part of this project that I'm especially excited about is looking at what I call incidental influence, or influence from these projects, consequences for China's influence that accrue from high profile projects through a number of different channels. But again, the idea here is that the visibility and the national salience of these projects puts these projects in a unique position. And it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because this visibility and the salience also creates political risk for both the host country leaders and for China's government as well. And sometimes this creates unintentional influence consequences. This can happen, again, in a few different ways. One way that is well documented by other research is when certain project actors, whether state-owned enterprises or other quasi or non-state actors who are involved in implementing these projects, when they elicit positive or negative reactions in host countries, this can set off a series of local and potentially national level reactions that involve both popular and elite audiences, and eventually affect China's influence bottom line. Another process is when these projects take on narratives of their own, and narratives that are crafted by narrative entrepreneurs in host countries, whether, again, at the popular or the elite level. And narratives about these projects that are beyond the control of China's government permeate popular discourse or elite discourse in developing countries. And sometimes there are even spillover effects, right? When these narratives get out of control and even go transnational and move to the international level. So the degree to which these narratives travel across borders is another important determinant of kind of how large these unintentional influence processes really get. And so the bottom line, though, is that in many cases, this can change bargaining outcomes for China and some of these governments. And we've seen examples of this in Indonesia, in Kenya, and Malaysia. These are some of the countries I look at in my work. Now, other researchers have shown in a variety of contexts and geographic settings that these dynamics are at work. And so what I'm trying to do in my project is demonstrate that there are actually observable patterns if we can systematically catalog the known universe of high-profile development projects. We see these different influence pathways occur again and again. And this is potentially a useful framework, both for scholars and for policymakers, for having a sharper understanding of how development projects connect to influence outcomes. And so I'm going to stop there in terms of the actual research, but I'd be happy to discuss the data. I also do some survey analysis and look at perceptions of these projects in developing countries as well. I just want to end with a couple, hopefully policy relevant points and some considerations for policy analysts. I think the first one is that policy analysis about aid and influence in China and the BRI would do well, I think, by concentrating on the most relevant projects for influence generation, rather than taking this implicit kind of dollars for influence approach. It's important to define the specific pathways through which influence travels. And influence, of course, is a net concept. It can be gained or lost. And it's important to remember when we think about both routine and unintended influence. The other point is just something I want to reiterate, which is that there's a strong political synergy between these very flashy, grandiose projects that I've shown you on the part of China and these host country governments. These projects are resilient. They've been around for a while. And so as easy as it is to look at these projects and dismiss them as being flashy or being white elephants or being wasteful and taking up scarce resources that could be used for other development projects, there is a hard political logic that makes a lot of sense when you think about the political incentives of both sides of these projects. Finally, again, influence is a net concept, and I think analysts and policymakers would do well to avoid inflating estimates of China's net influence. Again, this is a work in progress, but a lot of anecdotal evidence that we have about these high-profile projects suggests that, if anything, incidental influence that China experiences along the Belt and Road is probably more of a net negative than a net positive. And so it's important not to overreact about the overall influence bottom line that these projects create. I'll stop there, but I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Austin. Great research, looking at the pathways, taking the ride. All right, so I'd like to ask Kristen Hopewell you can share your screen and looking at a different, more, I like that we got the big projects and now we're going to a different kind of big projects, more dispersed. All right, here you go, Kristen, you got it?
Great, thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks.
So the title of my project is The Impact of China's Trade Policies on Global Development, focusing specifically on agriculture and fishery subsidies. So the project grew out of a book that I published recently with Cambridge University Press on the impact of US-China conflict on global trade governance. One thing that struck me as I was conducting research on the US-China trade war for the book was how little attention there's been to the impact of China's trade policies on the rest of the world, and particularly on developing countries. To date, the debate about China's trade practices has been overwhelmingly dominated by the US and other advanced economies like the EU and Japan. Their focus has primarily been on China's use of subsidies and other trade policies to promote its manufacturing and high-tech industries, everything from steel to semiconductors. What's been widely overlooked, though, is that China is also making use of highly trade-distorting policies in other sectors, like agriculture and fisheries, that are of significant concern to developing countries. China has often sought to portray itself as a champion of global development, pursuing a win-win form of economic globalization that benefits all countries. But in reality, many of China's trade policies are exacerbating hardship in some of the world's poorest countries. And at the same time, Beijing has also been undermining efforts to establish new and stronger WTO rules that are of critical importance to much of the developing world. So agriculture subsidies have long been seen as a symbol of the injustice of the trading system. Agriculture subsidies provided by richer countries depress global prices and undermine the competitiveness and incomes of poor farmers. Given the importance of agriculture to livelihoods, employment, and food security in many developing countries, reducing such subsidies is a pressing concern for much of the global South. Now, historically, developed countries were the primary source of the problem. The vast majority of agriculture subsidies were provided by rich countries like the US, the EU, and Japan. But that's changed dramatically in recent years. As China has grown richer, it's become the world's largest subsidizer of agriculture. In 2020, for example, China provided over $200 billion in subsidies and other forms of trade distorting support to its agriculture sector, vastly more than the EU, the US, or any other country. Now, although the commodities it subsidizes are primarily sold in its domestic market rather than exported, due to the scale of its subsidies, and because China is such a massive market, its policies have significant implications for other developing countries. China's subsidies artificially increase its domestic agricultural production, which has the effect of reducing demand for imports, as well as pushing down global prices, to the detriment of agricultural producers and exporters around the world. And due to its importance in global markets, as one market analyst put it, China's policies exert a colossal influence on world prices and trade patterns. Now, China insists that as a developing country, its subsidies are morally different than those provided by the US or EU. But for the rest of the developing world, the difference is immaterial. Regardless of where trade distorting subsidies originate, whether from a developed country or from China, their impact on global markets and thus on poor farmers in the developing world is the same. Due to the size of its market and the massive volume of subsidies that it's providing, China's agricultural trade policies have profound implications for other developing countries. Cotton provides a striking illustration of this. Cotton is among the most heavily supported agricultural commodities. And for years, a range of actors, from Oxfam to the World Bank, have highlighted the devastating effects of cotton subsidies for millions of poor farmers in the developing world. The US was once seen as the chief source of the problem, but China has now actually surpassed the US as the world's biggest cotton subsidizer. China alone now accounts for nearly 3/4 of all cotton subsidies provided worldwide. Over the past decade, China provided nearly $41 billion in cotton subsidies, almost 6 times more than the US. Now, cotton is of crucial importance to the Cotton 4 group of West African cotton producers, as well as to many other developing and least developed countries in Africa and throughout the world. Cotton is the second most important agricultural export for LDCs globally. These countries depend heavily on cotton exports for employment, government revenue, and foreign exchange. Cotton is one of the most important crops in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, with some 15 million people directly dependent on it. Burkina Faso, for instance, has an average income of just less than $800 a year and relies on cotton for nearly 60% of its export revenue. Now, African cotton producers are actually amongst the world's most competitive, but the subsidies provided by more affluent countries leave them struggling to compete in global markets. If cotton subsidies were eliminated to create a level playing field, there would be a significant shift in cotton production to African countries, whose farmers would enjoy higher prices and higher incomes. So reducing cotton subsidies has been seen as critical to alleviating poverty in some of the world's poorest countries. Today, however, the global cotton market depends more on policies made in Beijing than in Washington. As the site of over half of the world's textile production, the world cotton market now revolves around China. China is a relatively inefficient cotton producer, with production costs roughly 4 times those of some African countries. But state subsidies and other trade distorting policies have made China one of the biggest cotton producers. And China also uses tariffs as high as 40% to restrict cotton imports. China's heavy subsidies and its import barriers cause significant harm to poorer and weaker countries. Although the US undoubtedly remains part of the cotton problem, its subsidies are now dwarfed by those of China. Given its extraordinary market power and the massive scale of its subsidies, it's really impossible to address the global cotton problem today without tackling China's subsidies. And we've seen similar dynamics in fisheries. Since the collapse of the Doha Round, this has been identified as a priority area of negotiations at the WTO. Subsidies are driving overcapacity and overfishing and leading to the rapid depletion of the world's fish stocks. And importantly, this is not just an environmental issue, but also a development issue, because many developing countries depend heavily on fisheries for food security, livelihoods, and exports. The UN Sustainable Development Goals made achieving a WTO agreement to restrict harmful fisheries subsidies a major international priority. And the goal here is to try to achieve a triple win, an outcome that's good for trade, development, and the environment. But here too, it used to be the case that the biggest providers of subsidies were rich countries like the EU and Japan, in particular in this case. But what we've seen is that China now has the world's largest industrial and fishing fleet. China alone accounts for an extraordinary 42% of all global fishing activity, outstripping the next 10 biggest countries combined. And China is now also by far the world's biggest subsidizer, accounting for more than a quarter of all harmful fisheries subsidies worldwide. It spends more than $6 billion annually on such subsidies, nearly 3 times more than the next biggest subsidizers, the EU and Japan. So as you can see here, as in agriculture, when it comes to fisheries subsidies, China just dwarfs everyone else. Its subsidies have fueled the explosive growth of China's fishing industry and its outward expansion across the world's oceans. Most of China's own fisheries resources have been heavily depleted due to subsidies and overfishing. So the Chinese government has responded by providing subsidies for fuel, shipbuilding, and processing to enable its fleet to expand into international waters. China's fleet now operates heavily off the coasts of West Africa, Central and South America, and Antarctica. As Greenpeace puts it, Chinese fleets are all over the world now, and for many coastal and island developing countries, the impact has been devastating. In West Africa, for example, locals fishing in hand-hewn canoes are competing against Chinese industrial megatrawlers with mile-long nets that sweep up everything from surface to seabed. Chinese fishing vessels are so large that they capture as much fish in a single week as local boats catch in an entire year. Diminishing fish stocks have resulted in falling incomes for local fisherfolk, along with reduced domestic food supply. So as a representative of a Senegalese local fishing association put it, we're facing a catastrophe. And overfishing by the Chinese fleet has been similarly documented in other major fishing regions. Now, over the past several years, there have been efforts to try to negotiate new and stronger WTO rules on agriculture, cotton, and subsidies. But in all of these areas, China has resisted disciplines. In particular, it sought to evade new rules or disciplines by claiming access to special and differential treatment, SDT, as a developing country. But the reality is that meaningful rules on agriculture and fisheries subsidies are simply not possible without the full participation of China as the world's largest subsidizer. If China truly wants trade to be a win-win, then from the perspective of the developing world, tackling its agriculture and fisheries subsidies is an urgent priority. So thanks, I'll wrap up there and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much. And as you and also as Austin were talking, I had so many questions. We're going to wait, but I want to encourage the audience. You need to submit some email. Well, I'm asking you. Asia@wilsoncenter.org and at Asia Program on Twitter. We want to hear your questions. It's always loved, I know you'd rather be in the room with us drinking coffee, but not happening today. Thank you very much. That was really fascinating. And now we're going to pass the virtual mic over to Meir Alkan. I know he's a slide-free man today, which is cool. So why don't you start telling us your story there, Meir?
Yeah, good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the panel, and thanks very much to the China Environment Forum and the whole Wilson Center for putting together such a fantastic fellowship and a really great conversation. So this morning, we've been talking a lot about China's engagement with developing countries overall. And so what I'm going to talk about is sort of the larger framework of how we can think about this engagement vis-a-vis the global environment and the trajectory of sustainability writ large. And this is something that we've seen kind of increasing attention to in the realm of China's overseas influence overall. This was really evidenced quite clearly around the kind of breathless discussion, both the hyping and the sort of underhyping, if it were, as it were, of Xi Jinping's announcement at the UN General Assembly last fall about China's phasing out and canceling the construction of coal-fired power plants overseas, right? And I think this is something we're only going to see increased attention to in the US as we face the reality of kind of political paralysis and substantial domestic political obstacles to meaningfully fight climate change. I think this ups the ante and ups the stakes on sustainability and on decreasing carbon emissions globally, especially in the developing world. And certainly when we look to sort of that trajectory where the capital, the technology, the know-how for that is, so far it's largely been coming from China, and there's no immediate sense that that's likely to change. So, this all sort of suggests that we do need to pay attention to this, but we also need to be a little bit more nuanced in how we're thinking about the relationship between China's domestic politics, domestic economic situation, and its overseas investments. I mean, in general, if we look at policy writing, policymakers thinking about the sustainability implications of China's overseas investments in the BRI, we kind of see two narratives, either implicitly or explicitly put out there. And one kind of assumes that an implication of China's state capitalist system is that Beijing essentially has something approaching complete control over the economic actors that are involved in the Belt and Road, right? And because of this, we should understand overseas investments as more than anything an opportunity to release the kinds of pressure valves that China's economy faces domestically. Most prominent amongst these arguments is the idea that overseas investment is a way to solve problems of overcapacity, of excess industrial capacity in sectors such as coal-fired power, and that because of this, we really need to focus on putting pressure on Beijing to just stop this practice of exporting its overcapacity. A second narrative, which is distinct, really sees most of the Belt and Road investments as one that are driven by commercial interests and commercial actors, and therefore is sort of what is in terms of understanding that, we really need to focus on destination countries, politics, market constraints. And I think the point of fact, and this is emerging both in the from the previous panelists, but as well as from the research that I'll briefly sketch today, is that we really need to focus on the reality of the heterogeneity, the complexity on the ground, and look at the interactions between China's politics and what sends the BRI, what motivates the BRI, and the realities of destination country politics. So I'm going to sketch three pieces of research briefly that sort of look at this question of the interaction between China and host country politics in more depth. So first of all is turning to this question of overcapacity and the idea that China's investments overseas are really a solution to domestic market constraints. We see this implicitly and explicitly argued all the time, but in reality, there's really been almost no empirical test of this. So what I did was to create a database focused on all coal-fired power plants, both domestically within China and internationally overseas, in order to look at whether domestic market pressures facing Chinese firms that are responsible for owning and operating these coal-fired power plants explains these firms' patterns of investments overseas. So as part of this data set, I looked at different supply and demand constraints within China and how this changes over time as a result of different regions' economic growth, as a result of the introduction of new energy sources, particularly from renewable sources onto China's grid. This, together with efforts to close polluting industries and coal-fired power plants that are near China's urban centers, explains a lot of the disparate patterns of market pressure that different Chinese firms in the power sector face. And so what we see after this exercise of looking at these different patterns of domestic market conditions in the coal-fired power sector is that there's actually no relationship between these domestic market constraints and the patterns of overseas investment that we see in coal. Now, obviously, this shouldn't be taken to say that overcapacity isn't at some level an important part of how the Chinese government thinks about the policy framework around the Belt and Road. But it does suggest that in one sector, and one where I'd argue the attention on sort of the negative consequence of the BRI investments has been most marked, that the kind of conventional narrative is actually not really backed up by the evidence of what we see on the ground. So if it's not this sort of conventional narrative of overcapacity, one question is sort of, how do we think about the interplay between China and destination country politics? And the second piece of research that I've had the opportunity to work on during my time as a Wilson China Fellow has been exactly looking at this question. And it merges really well with the first presentation's discussion of elite level influence in the location and the types of projects that we see built. And so for this piece of research, I collaborated with Dr. Hongbo Yang of the Chinese Academy of Sciences to look at how political favoritism in projects affects the environmental impacts of these projects. So specifically what we did is looked at all Chinese projects spanning infrastructure, industry, and other sectors that might meaningfully be expected to have negative environmental impacts, and honed in on one particular problem, which is deforestation. Deforestation is something that we can measure using satellite data, which is what we do. It's also a good proxy for the kinds of land use changes and threats to biodiversity that many are concerned about, especially in the context of China's overseas infrastructure projects. And what we do is then construct a measure of political favoritism, which is whether Chinese financed projects are built in regions that are affiliated with the country's national leader, in regions where the national leader comes from. And what we find is that using an approach that allows us to compare not sort of project sites that China builds with other places which would never have been suitable for investment, but using an opportunity to compare sites that have already received Chinese investments with those that haven't, we show that places that have projects that are politically favored, where there's this political link between the national leader and the region where the project is built, see rates of deforestation that are much faster and much more extreme than others. And so I think this really highlights both the importance of elite politics, but the ways in which the tendency of Chinese investors, but be they state or non-state or parastatal, to align themselves with the national leader and to follow the national leader's interests in terms of project location, in terms of the regulatory environment around that, really structure and condition the environmental impacts that we see. Before concluding, I want to briefly turn to a third piece of research, which sort of thinks about the public opinion dynamics behind some of these projects. And specifically, I want to talk about a survey that focused on understanding public opinion dynamics around energy infrastructure projects. And this is administered jointly with Dr. Jennifer Haddon of the University of Maryland. In this project, we looked at how different project characteristics, so things like, for example, whether an energy infrastructure project is a coal-fired power plant, gas, solar, or wind, as well as characteristics related to the project developer, whether it's a domestic developer or an overseas developer, such as China, other East Asian project developers from South Korea or Japan, or European or US developers, how these different dimensions of energy infrastructure projects affects public opinion. Now, this is, we've generally discovered that the public opinion around this is both incredibly complex and well-informed, but the two top line results that I want to share today are first, that we see that there is an overwhelming preference for projects that are not coal-fired power. Respondents really want to see energy infrastructure built that is coming from solar, coming from wind, and sometimes coming from gas. So while this doesn't necessarily equal silver linings for the climate, because we do know that, of course, these gas-fired power plants are also causing large carbon emissions, it does suggest that coal has become increasingly politically toxic. And in open-ended responses and other tests of sort of what's driving these respondents to think this way, we see a consciousness about the environmental costs of coal-fired power that is really quite high. Second, and I think perhaps a particular concern for Beijing, is a substantial negative attitude towards projects developed by China. This is part of a larger bias against overseas developers, but we see that consistently China ranks far below South Korea, Japan, the US, Germany, or other overseas developers. I think this points to a really negative reputation deficit that has emerged with China as a developer. And that much of this may come from the mix of reality and perception of the environmental consequences of these projects. So just to conclude this with a few of the policy themes that I think this research points to, and I'm sure we're going to discuss this in more depth during the Q&A, I think this really highlights the importance of moving past kind of these simple narratives and understanding both what China is doing and what that means for the US response. And I think it suggests that we need a much more nuanced form of US engagement and much more involvement in, particularly in energy infrastructure and the regulatory environment in a lot of these countries. So I want to stop here. There are a lot of great topics to talk about, and I'm particularly excited to start dancing on the Belt and Road. So thanks, everyone.
Yes, I mean, not literally dancing on the Belt and Road, but I do like that image. There should be more dancing in policy dialogues, right? All right, so I guess that cue is for you. Stage left, Emily Wilcox putting up her PowerPoint slides, reminding everyone once again, submit. I'm starting to get some questions in. You don't want to be the last one to put questions in, or I won't have time to get to it. Asia@wilsoncenter.org or Twitter @AsiaProgram. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Jennifer. And
so how many more puns can I say? The stage is all yours. Sorry.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thanks to the Wilson Center for this wonderful opportunity. I've been listening to the webcast of the whole conference, and it's been wonderful. So the title of my talk today is Learning Diplomacy, China's South-South Dance Exchanges of the 1950s and 60s and their relevance today. So I'm shifting us over to the realm of culture and also shifting us back in time. So this image that I have here sparked initially my interest in exploring dance as a form of cultural diplomacy in China. And what you see is actually a group of Chinese students at the Beijing Dance School, which was the National Dance Conservatory in China, in 1957. And they are learning a Balinese dance from teachers who were specifically sent from Indonesia to train Chinese students to perform Indonesian dance. And if you look very carefully, you can see in the very back of the image, there's actually a gamelan orchestra that's also part of this project that was sent from Sukarno himself as part of this exchange. So this is happening 2 years after the 1955 Bandung Conference. It's happening in the 1950s at a time when China was strategically engaging in diplomacy with countries outside the socialist world, and specifically in what we now call the global South, as a way to expand its international connections at a time when the United States and its allies were isolating China from international organizations such as the UN, imposing trade embargoes and using other methods to isolate China from relationships with other countries. And what I really want to focus on in this, this image is the relationship of the power hierarchy in this exchange. So we have Chinese students who are being taught by dancers from Bali, from Indonesia, as a way to develop a relationship between the countries of China and Indonesia at this critical juncture. So I'm calling this type of diplomacy learning diplomacy, in which rather than projecting China's culture abroad, China is actually taking on the positionality of the learner and reversing the traditional power hierarchy as a way of expressing a form of equality and a form of mutual respect, which was considered to be at the crux of China's strategic practice of cultural diplomacy with what was then known as the Third World or the Intermediate Zone or the Afro-Asian countries. So like Kristen, this project grew out of my first book, Revolutionary Bodies, Chinese Dance and the Socialist Legacy, published in 2018, in which I combed through the historical archival sources on the history of dance in China in the 20th century, and also did extensive ethnographic field research. And the book focused on the history of dance in China. And in this process, I discovered a huge amount of dance in diplomacy that I'm now thinking about in this new project. So of course, China's dance diplomacy during the period I'm looking at, which is what we sometimes call the 17 years period in PRC history. This is prior to the Cultural Revolution. We see three major types of diplomacy happening. So the first two are the more traditional kinds that we also see in many other countries, such as the United States and the Soviet Union at this time. So sending Chinese dance abroad, as well as hosting foreign dance companies in China. There's extensive documentation of this going in both directions. But what I want to look at today is the third kind, which is this exchange through learning. So in terms of the dance tours abroad, one of the things we see during this period is a strong emphasis on the promotion of Chinese folk and classical dance performance in tours abroad. And this is just to give you an idea of all the countries where Chinese dance tours traveled during this period. So we can see that the Global South is very well represented here. World festivals of youth and students were held every couple of years in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and attracted dancers from all over the world, not just the socialist bloc countries. And we also had extensive examples of foreign dance companies touring China. And you can just see some examples here from the mid-1950s and early 60s. Now, the dance exchanges as mutual learning are quite interesting, and I talk about some case studies in the paper, but just to give you some examples. So in the upper left-hand corner here, you can see during the Korean War, a North Korean dancer, Che Seung-hee, was invited to set up a dance program, again, teaching Chinese students at the Central Academy of Drama in Beijing. On the bottom left-hand corner, we have an instance in the early 1960s when China was really working hard to establish its relationship with Myanmar. And Chinese dancers were performing classical Burmese dance for UNU as an effort to establish this mutual trust and appreciation between China and Burma. We also see examples in reverse where we have the Soviet National Folk Dance Ensemble learning Chinese dance as a way to express this kind of mutual respect and alliance at this time. So this specific strategy was actually something that has been attributed to Zhou Enlai. And in dancers' memoirs, we see specific recollections of Zhou specifically out extensive documentation in the newspapers and periodicals of the era. So here we see a dancer from India during a delegation tour teaching a group of Chinese students. Then in the program, we see documented a piece in which the Chinese dancers actually performed alongside the Indian dancers on stage, performing what they had learned from their Indian teacher. We see many other examples, such as major Chinese performing arts ensembles performing Indian theater pieces at this time. And then we also see prominent Chinese dancers studying with prominent dancers from the Global South and learning to perform their individual choreographic repertoires. And then finally, at the end of this period in 1962, we see the establishment of an entire national level state-sponsored performing arts ensemble known as the Oriental Song and Dance Ensemble, which took as its goal using dance and foreign exchange, specifically by performing songs and dances of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. By the mid-1960s, we see a further escalation of this type of work into full-length stage dance narratives about various types of anti-racial protest or anti-racial violence and the protests that were happening in the US, as well as criticizing US interventions in places like the Congo. So I think this is relevant for our thinking today in terms of understanding China's relationship with the Global South. And first, I want to point out that at this time in the late 1950s and early 1960s, US China watchers and the US state were actually very aware of the importance of cultural diplomacy in China's international relations with the Global South. And they published extensive documentations of this. However, they focused mainly on which countries they were exchanging with and the number. They were very interested in the number of exchanges back and forth, but there was a lack of attention to the actual type of exchange and the specific strategies of cultural diplomacy that China was engaged in. And the reason I think this is relevant for us today is that scholars who've looked at China's public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy in the 21st century have noted a continued emphasis on this idea of promoting a sense of equality with the Global South as something that has been really attractive for countries from the Global South. So here looking at, for example, countries from Africa in their relationships with China. So in this book, the author says that creating these feelings of equality between China and Africa is a fundamental characteristic of China's public diplomacy toward Africa. Okay. And Ben Abdallah emphasizes this idea of relationality being central to China's engagement with Africa. And again, she, from her fieldwork with African dignitaries, diplomats, and participants in these skill training workshops, she again notes this idea of being treated as equals as an important part of African experiences in these types of exchanges. So I want to end by thinking about how scholars in cultural studies and the humanities are actually thinking about culture in ways that are more complex and nuanced in some ways than traditional cultural diplomacy. And so, for example, we have new articles coming out that are thinking about how cultural diplomacy should actually be thought of not as a practice of taking a cultural object and promoting it outward or promoting a national image outward, but actually as a fostering a relationship and engaging in an open-ended process of dialogue and collaborative approaches specifically. And specifically, we even see in the US government some of these ideas being promoted as an appropriate approach for US cultural diplomacy. So for example, in 2003, we see Milton Cummings just defining cultural diplomacy as, quote, the exchange of ideas, information, art, and other aspects of culture among nations and their peoples in order to foster mutual understanding. So I think we can see these earlier examples of China's dance diplomacy with the Global South as an early effort to engage in this type of more dialogic and collaborative type of open-ended cultural diplomacy that in some ways can be a harbinger for the type of approaches to cultural diplomacy that we can take with China, but I think also that we need to really consider when thinking about US cultural relations with the Global South and how that might relate to or be different from China's approaches. So lastly, I just wanted to say that if you're interested in learning more about dance diplomacy, I have published on a number of the topics that I discussed today, and I would encourage you to reach out and read more if you're interested. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Yeah, beforehand, before the meeting started, I made a comment that when I was my first year teaching English in Changsha, that the head of our foreign affairs office was the Fred Astaire. And I was, besides teaching me how to foxtrot and other things, I do remember that sometimes we did do folk dances. And then you mentioned that at that time there was also mimicking China, there was Chinese breakdancing as well. So dance featured quite prominently for me when I was early in China. And also just realizing that in the books, when I was doing a lot of self-studies on Chinese, I was reading like these older books. And I remember thinking that the transliteration of the names were kind of strange initially. And then I realized, because they weren't American names, right? They were African, they were Southeast Asian names. So the diplomacy also went with the putting them into their Chinese language learning. All right, we're going to start off with a question from actually the China fellow from last year, Jessica Liao. So I'm going to direct the first one she asked was for you, Austin. Can you elaborate more about the strong policy incentives on both the China and host country side that sustain this high profile project diplomacy, using some more specific examples, and also explain the repercussions for the host society by such decisions? I was thinking with that latter part of the question made me think also what Meir said about the public opinion. Because clearly, I mean, from what Meir said, that there's the general public maybe, and maybe experts are not as happy with these projects, but the big politicians are. We'll hold that, and then I'll put the next one be to Kristen. But go ahead, Austin. Can you give us a little answer to that?
Yes, absolutely, and thank you for the question. So yes, I'm also very interested in what I call the synergy between the political incentives on both sides. So let me start with the host country government side and give you the basic logic, and then maybe work through an example. But the basic idea is that, again, high profile projects have a couple of distinct features. They are, again, visible at the national level, and they have this political salience in part due to their visibility. And so there are these unique sources of external capital that other development projects can't claim to be. So the vast majority of development projects that, whether we're talking about China or other bilateral and multilateral donors provide, can't punch at this weight, essentially. And so these can get the attention of lots of people in host countries. But at the elite level, this enables politicians to access otherwise unavailable sources of project finance. For example, in the case of Costa Rica, I gave this financing for a new stadium. The stadium was badly needed. Costa Rica's previous national stadium had been built, I believe, in 1924. And even though Costa Rica is a relatively prosperous country in its region, this type of prestige seeking at scale just simply wouldn't have been available without this form of financing. And so this enabled the incumbent government to essentially brand this as a really strategic and game-changing, as I use in the title of my talk, flagship project. And so this is a unique type of financing that China has been able to provide. And one thing that I'm looking at in my research is, again, if this project is branded as this national achievement, in the host country context, well, what does that mean for public opinion consequences? And I didn't have enough time in my talk to go over this, but what I'm finding, similar to Mir, is some mixed kind of heterogeneous results. So it really depends on the project type. And I'm starting to distinguish in particular between these high profile projects that are more public facing and have more public use versus projects that are primarily private use. Envision something like a presidential palace versus a stadium project. These are two prestige projects, but they cater to very different groups, right? Or a national theater versus, a new Ministry of Foreign Affairs building. And so some of these other project features matter as well. And then again, on the China side, as much negative criticism as China often attracts for doing things like stadium diplomacy, there is clear evidence that these projects are closely linked to high-level diplomatic support for China, whether we're talking about diplomatic recognition in the example I gave or strategic voting in the United Nations General Assembly. But as controversial as many of these projects are, I want to make the point that I don't find definitive public opinion evidence that these projects are universally loathed in developing countries. And in fact, in the case of Costa Rica, it is because this is a project that happened 10 or 12 years ago. It's a little bit difficult to collect comprehensive public opinion evidence on this, but based on some qualitative research that's been done by historians and by geographers, if anything, it seems like the public opinion effects were actually a net positive. So there are success stories as well.
Just for me here, do you find in general that the public is not as, because you mentioned that a lot of these big projects are really just a small percentage of all the money that they're putting in. Are you also going to do you see kind of any other similar results? Because if the Chinese is investing in these other projects, is that just more for just economic gain for the Chinese companies, and it's that those are not generally diplomatic? do you think?
Right. So in listening to your question, I remember there was another part of Jessica's question as well that's connected to this that I want to come back to, which is really about the economic and kind of the societal impacts of these projects. So in my measuring of these projects in the context of the broader portfolio of development finance that China provides, the average, for example, the average prestige project is somewhere around $45 or $50 million USD. The average debt-based debt finance development project that China provides is much larger. So in some other work that I look at, and not to insert a shameless plug here, but I also have a book coming out at the end of March called Banking on Beijing that looks at this dimension of China's development finance. And what my co-authors and I find is that indeed it is these larger, big ticket, debt-driven infrastructure projects that tend to move the needle more in terms of both good and bad socioeconomic impacts. And so for me, the study of these high profile projects, prestige projects are kind of a subset of this larger group, but they're an especially interesting one to study from a policy perspective because the political logic is very clean compared to some of these projects that have more of a commercial motivation as well. So I'm attracted to studying these. And I don't find any evidence, this isn't something that I look at as much for my Wilson project, but I don't find strong evidence that prestige projects in particular have major impacts for better or worse on development outcomes, at least in the short term. But one of the challenges, this is just a preview of what's coming in the pipeline, is that for the first period in which I was working on this project, I only had 15 years of data to analyze. But in going backwards, just like Emily does in her work, I go all the way back to 1949. And now I have a much bigger time series. And it turns out that China's been doing this for a long time. So I am looking forward to looking at some of those downstream impacts as well.
That last comment you made, I think that overall, all of you in different ways had kind of stereo breaking, busting going on here in thinking, like just like how far back China has been, going overseas, because, the Belt and Road is like, look, we're here. And like, no, you've been there for a while, but in different forms. All right, to kind of stick with another question from Jessica to Mir, can you elaborate more about assessing whether or to what extent the coal power sector is facing the overcapacity problem? Also elaborate on how do you assess whether there's no causal relationship between the overcapacity problem and the overseas development of coal power project. She wants, because we cruelly gave you only 10 minutes to talk. So she wants you to dig a little bit in the weeds. If it's too weedy, we'll connect you on email, but tell us a little bit more, because that was actually a big kind of like, because for years, many of us are saying like, well, China's closing down their coal. And they did early on, they were dismantling coal-fired power plants and moving them overseas. We had a speaker yesterday in my steel and cement panel said that it appeared at one steel site that it was a brand new location, brand new plant, but the plant was not new. And so there are examples, and it kind of makes me think that maybe, those kind of stories, just like, that we kind of overblow them, that maybe it's not the real trend. So what do you have to say to Jessica, a little bit more detail about the overcapacity problem?
Jennifer, I think you're completely right in that, if we think about how we understand something as complicated and as huge as the BRI or China's overseas footprint, that having these really vivid images of, a plant that's taken apart and literally sent overseas. This is visually something that we can really latch onto and bite into and gives us an understanding of what's happening. And I don't by any means sort of downplay the reality of what that is. I guess, as sort of from a social scientific perspective, if we want to think about this in a more systematic way, then we think, well, what is we need to find something that varies. What is the sort of source of variation that we can use to explain different patterns of overseas investment in different sectors over time? Because if it's just sort of overcapacity, if that's the story, then why is there why do we see such temporal variation as well as cross-country variation as well as intersectoral variation in what these investments look like? And so I sort of start off with that variation as the core of the analysis, which is to say that if the sort of conventional story of overcapacity in the coal-fired power sector is true, then we would expect that it is those firms that are facing the most domestic market constraint within China that would be most likely to invest overseas. And I think the qualitative evidence suggests that it's exactly these kinds of pressures that firms can, either lobby for preferential access to financing, to insurance, to the introductions necessary to make this. And that would say, okay, so we should see this at the firm level. And that's where my data set sort of starts off, is to really catalog these assets domestically and internationally at the firm level to see whether there's really any pattern overall for which firms are going overseas. Now, I mean, I don't think we should assume that from a policy perspective that there aren't national level policies that Beijing puts into place that can make the construction, financing, technological transfer of coal-fired power more or less feasible for Chinese firms. I definitely think that's the case, and I think that's a place where there has been a lot of international focus, and where we should continue to put a lot of international focus, because if the UNGA announcement shows us anything, it's that kind of focus and attention can help, at least rhetorically, to generate some positive movement in this space. But I think that is very different from believing that this overcapacity is what explains, what drives, what causes this investment. And if we sort of, recognize that it's more complicated than that, I think it opens up a lot more room for dialogue and analysis and investigation of what's actually happening.
It's complicated. I mean, I'm later in April, I'm going to have a meeting about China's more nuclear power overseas. And it is complicated as well. Some of that was done when they delinked nuclear power price from coal, and that affected its market within China. So that wasn't overcapacity, but there's more stories, and I really appreciate you delving into the complexities. Speaking of complexities and extra detail, Kristen, Jessica also had a question. We give her 3 because she's special, but fantastic research. Both cotton and fishery sectors are considered politically sensitive these days. I wonder if your research discusses the difficulties given China's domestic politics that makes reform in these 2 sectors difficult. And then I have a follow-on for you too, because you can answer that part first.
Great, thanks, Jessica, for a fantastic question. That's certainly one of the challenges with China's subsidies, is that these are not just motivated by strictly economic motives of trying to foster rural development, for example, but there are whole sets of complicated political or strategic motives also involved as well. In the case of cotton, for example, most of China's cotton production takes place in Xinjiang, largely through government-owned or government-controlled cotton farms, and that's very much a part of the subsidies and trying to promote. This is very much a part of efforts to sinicize and pacify the Xinjiang region and the government's, all of its activities there. In terms of the fisheries issue, there too, they're not just strictly economic motives, but also strategic motives. China's trying to fuel the expansion of its fishing fleet across the world's oceans, in part as an effort to, exert and project its power globally throughout the world's oceans, and ultimately challenge, the U.S. dominance and control of the world's oceans. And so this is part of the challenge of trying to address China's subsidies. Is one aspect of the subsidies is, of course, fostering rural development, trying to address rural poverty. It's important to remember that, incomes in China's rural sector remain extraordinarily low, in the range of about $2,000 a year, both in agriculture and in fishing. So part of the motivation is to try to boost incomes, foster rural development, address the massive rural to urban inequalities that we see in China. But at the same time, if China's goal with agriculture subsidies, for example, were solely to address rural poverty, there are other ways that it could do that. It could do that, for example, through direct payments to farmers that were delinked from production, or investing more heavily in social welfare systems, health, education, pensions, and so forth. Part of China's goal with its agriculture subsidies, though, is not just to address rural poverty or inequality, but also specifically to boost agricultural production. One of China's goals is to try to achieve self-sufficiency in key strategic agricultural commodities. And part of the reasoning for that is concerns about, potential future conflict with the US, for instance, cutting off its access to global grain markets. The US has used food embargoes in the past against China, and there's very much a concern, given its legacy of its history of famine, that ensuring self-sufficiency in key strategic food commodities is critical, given how much power the US has over global grain markets. So it's this complex nexus of both economic and political or security motives that makes this problem of Chinese subsidies so vexing.
But also for the cotton, with a lot of it growing in Xinjiang. Years ago, I screened a film for the DC Environmental Film Festival, and it was called The Cotton Road. Did you ever see that one? Where it's taking, you're taking a train ride with a lot of Sichuan farmers who are basically being, they are voluntarily, they've been kind of called to go to Xinjiang and harvest cotton. So, because a lot of the farms back then, this was back when a lot of the farms used to be owned by the PLA, and now it's just government farms. So it's really industrial farming, but it was this also a little bit of the, Han Chinese are being brought in to pick it. And it's just, so it doesn't exactly live up to, like what you're saying, to the subsidies. I guess one quick question about the last one about the fish. I wonder if you, in your research, if you saw how the distant fishing, again, subsidies are supporting all these ships going further out, but how some BRI investments may be helping to egg this on. I mean, we hear stories of, there's a port that's being built and next to it, a fish processing plant. Do you have any examples of that? I mean, I don't know, saying that it's coordinated, but that does BRI play a role in some of this farming investments?
Definitely the fisheries case for sure. As part of the BRI, China's been investing heavily in overseas fishing bases, which provide hubs for its distant water fishing fleet. And so one of the things that's enabled China to do is to cut back on its fuel subsidies. For example, its fuel subsidies enable its fleets to travel these vast distances and remain at sea for as much as 2 years at a time. But by constructing these overseas fishing bases, that provides a hub for its fishing fleet across many different major fishing regions. So China's been able to cut back on some of its more traditional subsidies as it switches to this other model of trying to support the global expansion of its fleet. But definitely its subsidies for fishing are intricately interlinked with the BRI.
No, thank you for that. You guys are all doing great research, and now we have to do a little bit of dancing again. I was curious about that. I mean, I'm sure COVID probably messed up your research as well, but I'm kind of interested in also kind of a lasting legacy of just the dance in China. I mean, was it just a fluffy thing they did back in the 50s and 60s? But do you see currently in China, are there dance troupes that are devoted to this kind of dancing? And I mean, does it go on? Did it become, because I don't know if the government still supports this kind of, and that's the other question, again, pre-COVID, the Chinese government still supporting this kinds of learning diplomacy, particularly around dance? Or is there another kind of learning diplomacy that you've seen?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. So it's really interesting. We see definitely in this era, especially the Bando 60s, a really clear strategy around overturning cultural hierarchies. So there's a recognition on the Chinese side that part of China's special position in relation to the global South or the third world is that it is also a formerly colonized country. And so it really wants to distinguish itself from the US in particular in terms of its approaches to culture. And so whereas the US at this time is promoting American modern dance and to a certain extent like Balanchine style American ballet abroad, really heavily exporting US dance abroad as a way to promote these ideas of American individualism and freedom and all these things. China is really strategically saying, first of all, we're not going to import modern dance from the US because it's bourgeois and ideologically problematic, but also we are going to look differently at this cultural hierarchy that assumes everybody wants to learn Western elite culture. And so part of the strategy was saying, we are going to take seriously, Burmese classical dance and Indian classical dance and these folk forms from around the global South as worthwhile artistic endeavors. And so the Oriental Song and Dance Ensemble was established in part to project that idea that cultures from around the world matter, and we are not buying into this hierarchy in which ballet and modern dance and other Western elite forms are at the top. So By the end of the 1970s, when China had, really changed its relationship to the United States in particular, we see a complete shift in this cultural strategy. So suddenly, the companies that are coming to China are actually American modern dance companies by the 80s. And there's a lot more emphasis on importing elite Western culture at that point. And we see that in the 1980s, 1990s, and to a certain extent that continues today. So when you look at the international companies that are touring in China now, it's mostly coming from North America and Europe, or Russia, and they're mostly contemporary dance and ballet companies. And to a certain extent, you have a lot of flamenco and tango coming, but those kind of exist on the level of what's seen as Western elite concert dance in China. And so I think the struggle right now is that China is re-engaging with the Global South through BRI. But I think it's been much more difficult in the arts world to actually maintain this legitimate desire to learn from dance forms that are not the elite Western dance forms. And this is a problem of the continued hegemonic status of Western elite culture and kind of a shift away from revolutionary positionality in China in general. And we see culture as one manifestation of that. And so, for example, in 2017, when I was doing fieldwork in Urumqi, I attended a dance festival, which was pretty unusual in the sense that all of the companies were coming from the global South. So it was like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Democratic Republic of the Congo. But you don't see those types of festivals as much in the major cities like Shanghai and Beijing. It's to a lesser extent.
Do the Chinese dancers, again, pre-COVID, any kind of still that kind of the Chinese taking their dance overseas as well?
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of promotion of Chinese dance overseas. And there is still the learning diplomacy type of work going on, but I've seen it actually more in terms of China sending ethnographers, for example, to Nepal to study local folk dance forms. And so it's not quite I wouldn't say it's the same level of equality that's being projected there.
Okay, and I see that Kristen has a hand up. Sorry. Did you have a question for Emily?
Yeah, picking up on the last thing you said, that you're not seeing the same sort of culture of equality in the diplomacy today. I wanted to ask you, I think this concept of learning diplomacy is fascinating. And, you're talking about China in the past taking on this position of learner in its diplomacy and sort of this very humble position. Wanted to ask, to what extent do you see continuity there, or have you seen a shift in the nature of Chinese diplomacy as its power on the international stage has grown, as it's become increasingly assertive in global politics?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, would you characterize its diplomatic strategy as similar, or have we seen a shift?
Yeah, so that's why I was looking to the current scholarship on Chinese cultural diplomacy to see whether this emphasis on respect and equality is still there. And as some of the sources I cited do show that that is still there to a certain extent. But for example, in Lena Ben-Abdallah's work, she talks about how the fact that the Chinese organizations are teaching important technological skills to African laborers, that's actually seen as something that differentiates China from the European countries, because the European countries wouldn't teach those skills and would maintain a relationship of dependence. So even though China is in the position of teaching in that relationship, it's seen as something that is helping in African countries to gain independence in a way that European countries are not. And so it's using that kind of relationship of pedagogy in a way to still show respect, but not necessarily through learning.
Thank you for that, for asking that question. And now remember, all you guys can ask each other questions. Just put your hand up, and I promise not to miss it. I should actually, the very first question that came in, I'm sure Dan Pearson's like, when are you going to ask it? Dan Pearson, a trade policy fellow at Americans for Prosperity. And I believe this is to you, Austin, because that's the one you were talking. You discuss pathways that link Chinese interests with interests of governments receiving project loans. Have you had an opportunity to consider the role played by bribery and corruption in greasing these pathways? Would it be feasible for the United States to compete with China's efforts in a way that would allow lenders and contractors to remain in compliance with the U.S. Foreign Corruption Practices Act? What do you say, Austin?
Thank you. I was about to ask my own question, so ask another question. So I'll save it and I'll answer this one.
Yeah.
So this is a really important question. In terms of greasing the wheels and this, potentially different channel than the one I was talking about, the short answer is yes. So in some of the broader work that I do on studying the aims and impacts of Chinese aid and debt projects, essentially what I end up finding is that, again, projects that are financed by China's government and that are financed through debt, so primarily loan-based financing that tends to be more commercially oriented. First of all, there's a strong association between this type of financing and more corrupt environments, both in particular at the country level. So countries that score lower on a lot of major corruption indices tend to get more debt financing from China. And there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, because in a different set of analyses, what my team and I find is that not only is there this association, but once these projects occur, later on, we also find that they tend to exacerbate corruption in those environments. And one of the explanations that that we have is basically a greasing the wheels type of argument. And basically Chinese policy banks, in particular China Exim Bank and China Development Bank, find it easier to transact in these environments with weaker anti-corruption regimes, with weaker regulatory regimes. Now, in terms of what the United States might be able to do about that, I don't want to be overly pessimistic, but I do think there is a reality here where, again, there is a natural, I don't want to keep using the word synergy, but there's a reason why this is happening, right? And so there are incentives between politicians and also Chinese contractors as well to continue to transact in this way. And in particular, this isn't necessarily all bad. So this is not to say that just because these projects are associated with corruption, everything about them is negative. In some places, China is effectively the lender of first resort and the lender of last resort. These places would not be able to access other forms of capital. And so it's important to keep that in mind. But it doesn't mean that the US is going to be able to be competitive in these environments either, unless there's a fundamental change in the host environment's policies, right? And so, unfortunately, I think this is a challenge, and I think talking about corruption and potential coordination on that as well between, say, China and some other prominent bilateral and multilateral donors and lenders, I think we're a ways off from seeing any of that as well. And so I think this is one area where I'm relatively pessimistic. I don't see a ton of options for the US, and I would agree with what one of the other panelists said, which is that the US should be much more tactical and careful in trying to respond to the BRI in ways that really focus on US comparative advantages. So not necessarily trying to loan in the same way that China does, but trying to identify what those comparative advantages are. I think Mir's work gives some good examples of what that could be, at least in projects in the energy sector. But more generally, I think this is a real problem.
Next, before I ask a question for all of you, what was your question that you had for one of your fellow panelists, Austin?
Well, as you might not be surprised, Mir, but I want to ask you a follow-up question on I think it was your second piece of research, which was about the study on political favoritism. And one kind of clarification, was this mainly also about coal-fired power plants? And if so, I would just love to hear a little bit more about what is the political logic in some of these host countries, and what exactly is kind of are the home regions of leaders in developing countries, for example, hoping to get more coal-fired projects? And given some of your other findings about public opinion, for example, I'd just like to hear more about what the political logic looks like on the host country side. I find this really fascinating.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question, and I appreciate that, especially in sort of. There's a lot of great research in this panel, so I've moved pretty fast through that. So let me just clarify that the findings about deforestation are not focused on coal-fired power, or not even focused on the energy sector. They, in fact, use the fantastic database that you and your team at William and Mary put together to look at all projects that can be reasonably thought to have a physical impact. So anything where we're not talking about sort of a loan to a government ministry, or a loan that is being allocated in a way that can't be geographically located, anything where there's a reasonable level of geographic precision, we include in that analysis. So it's much broader. It's really about any sort of physical investment and project that China might be involved in. And to the second part of that, of sort of sort of how to sort of think about that in terms of China's larger, investment. And I think that the major sort of takeaway that I think of that is that, here we really see that there are probably a lot of variation in some contexts. There may be de jure regulations which a national leader is in place is able to sort of bend. In other cases where the environmental protection might be more de facto, having that political capital and political power behind a project again makes it more likely that the interests of stakeholders, of local populations who might push back against it is less likely to win out in the political process, whether that be one that's sort of democratic or semi-legal, or if it's a much more informal one. Either way, that those groups who are more invested in the local environment are facing kind of an uphill political battle.
Okay, thank you so much. Now I want to just we have just a few minutes left, but I thought that I'd mention Emily, you could ask your question when you give your response here. I want everyone to, you guys have really interesting research, very diverse, but we're Wilson Center, DC. What are some key takeaway for US policymakers? I know that Mir and Austin talked a little bit, and and all of you did a little bit, but why don't we start out with Emily? Why don't you tell us your research on the dance learning diplomacy, and then you could ask your question too, but real quick, gotta be short.
Sure, yeah. So, I think that when we in the United States think about cultural diplomacy with China, I think we could do a lot more to project this actual desire to learn from each other, rather than, the United States sets the model that everybody else has to follow, or else they're our enemy. And I think it's difficult, in Washington to even think that way and to talk that way. But I think that if we think of that act itself as a type of diplomatic gesture that can lead to, it can lead to expanding our own influence, paradoxically, because that's what China did at that time. I think if we take some of these more complicated, nuanced understandings of cultural diplomacy, I think that would actually help to improve our relationships, not only with China, but also with the global South.
Super.
And then really quickly, my question, if we have time, I think that this whole topic of China's relationship to the global South and BRI really necessitates new kinds of research methods. And so I was curious to learn more from Austin and Meyer and Kristen about these large data sets that you talked about, and sort of the need to work across national boundaries. And if you have any kind of lessons that you've learned for how to do this in the future.
Yeah, I was thinking data sets too, but so you can add a little bit onto that. How about Kristen? Why don't you enter your research, a little bit, anything else you want to add about significance to US policymakers?
Yeah, certainly. So implications for policy, I think the key one is the US has a lot of room to make common cause with allies and to work with a broader, more diverse group of countries in trying to address its concerns about Chinese subsidies and other trade policies. The cases I talked about today, agriculture and fisheries, these are both cases where the US actually has a keen interest in reducing Chinese subsidies. The US is the world's biggest agricultural exporter. It has a real interest in seeing China's subsidies being disciplined, an interest it shares with many developing countries. And the same is true in fisheries. The US is not a big user of harmful fisheries subsidies. Most of US subsidies are directed towards conservation. So here too, the US has potential to make real allies. And I think, in the spirit of what Emily said, that should be approached with an attitude of respect and not sort of a condescending or patronizing attitude towards working with countries from the global South. But this really calls for the US to re-engage with the WTO. For many years, the US has really been disengaged from that institution. And there's room here. China has signaled it is potentially willing to negotiate on subsidies in a broad-based fashion, provided countries like the US are willing to engage in as well, and also discuss tackling their own subsidies. So there's room here for negotiation, provided we work with allies and through international institutions like the WTO as well. Thanks.
Okay, how about Mir?
Sure, yeah. So I think there are three very quick policy points that I want to highlight. First, in the realm of energy infrastructure, the US needs to provide alternatives, work with like-minded partners to help provide alternatives for sustainable investments. There's clearly demand for this in destination countries. In terms of the larger environmental impact around China's projects. I think that's a place where there needs to be a broader multilateral efforts to continue to strengthen the regulatory environment in destination countries, increase transparency. And third, sort of in the realm of public diplomacy, is that there's only so much oxygen and room for effective pressure and dialogue with Beijing. And so every time we get into overwrought, broad-based negative discussions of the BRI, bang on this debt trap diplomacy gong, we distract from real opportunities to pressure and to encourage Beijing to continue to do the BRI, but to do it in sustainable ways.
Yeah, and should note that the last year at the climate COP in Glasgow, with the declaration signed between the US and China, there was a line in there saying that we should coordinate working together to decarbonize the South. So the doors are opening. How we walk through the threshold, we don't know. Austin, did you have any final? You talked a little bit already about some of the significant for policymakers. Did you want to say something about the data? The kind of the data.
I could do that. I was going to make, since as you said, this is the Wilson Center, I was going to make a couple additional policy points. And these are points that others have made, and I think my research essentially reinforces them. Concerned parties about the BRI, I think they are best off empowering host country governments and civil societies with better information. This is where change would occur, given China's approach to the BRI, which is both economic and political. Don't just criticize, provide alternatives, as others have suggested. And don't expect that simply countering the Belt and Road with alternatives will fundamentally change China's approach. And don't be afraid of mutual learning either. Not everything that China is doing is bad. Finally, on the data, one very brief remark is that yes, I've been very lucky to work on a number of these data sets. What I've actually learned in the past few years is the importance of melding this quantitative work with careful, again, in a non-COVID world with field work, but more generally with mixed methods that involve qualitative interviews, even if they're on Zoom, and in other methods as well. I think that's been the most productive for me, and that's what I've learned in recent years. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity to comment on both policy and research. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking actually that for my project, and I might be tapping on knocking on your doors, that having a conversation about this growing way of doing research with data sets, because data is available. So we should get into that. You guys are fabulous. Again, myth busting, opening minds, thinking more on nuance. Yeah, you guys are you're the vanguard of new China research here. And I want to thank you for participating in the fellowship and talking today. Want to remind the audience that the fun continues at 1 p.m. We've got another panel, Southeast Asia and China, a complex interaction. Yeah, that's the thing. Complex, nuance, pay attention, America. There's a lot going on and we need to look at the details. Thank you so much again for everyone in the audience for listening in and asking great questions. And hopefully I'll be watching at 1 o'clock as well. So take care, everyone. Bye.